My name's Dom Watts, and I'm going to talk today about language attitudes. Talk about language is never ideologically neutral. Everyone has some kind of opinion on the subject. Practically everyone is a language user, after all. Some people hold their opinions very strongly. Very often we find that talking about language reveals attitudes that aren't about language at all. Instead, they really cover for attitudes towards the people who speak them. These attitudes are often negative, but they can also be very positive ones. Much of the time they have elements of both. People will say, for example, that language form X sounds beautiful to their ear, but using it in some circumstances would be a mistake. They might say, for instance, that although they love the sound of a Newcastle accent, it would be totally unsuitable for reading the national news on TV, or if it was being used by a brain surgeon. We'll focus for the remainder of this talk on accent rather than dialect. We're interested here only in pronunciation, rather than other aspects of language variation such as dialect, vocabulary or grammar. Our recent research focuses on the links between biases towards or against certain accents and how these biases can lead to discrimination. In other words, we're looking at situations in which accent prejudices can result in preferential treatment for speakers of certain accents but not for others. This kind of unequal treatment seems perfectly reasonable to many people. They might say that someone who doesn't speak clearly or correctly doesn't deserve to do well in life. These attitudes rest on ideas of rightness and wrongness in language, or, put another way, good versus bad. Many would insist that changing one's accent is no more difficult than changing one's clothes or hairstyle, and that taking special care over the pronunciation of words is no different from maintaining high standards in other forms of appearance and behaviour. The way one speaks is then a matter of choice. The research I'll be talking about for the remainder of this part of the session comes out of a 3-year project, Accent Bias in Britain, which was run jointly between the University of York and Queen Mary University London. The study was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. As we all know, a person's accent encodes all sorts of information about social background, geographical origins, education, and so forth. George Bernard Shaw's well-known dictum in the introduction to his play Pygmalion, though over 100 years old, still resonates very strongly today. When we hear an accent, it acts as a shortcut to a host of associations and stereotypes, which in spite of ourselves we use to pigeonhole the speaker in a particular social echelon. The inspiration for the study came from a 2015 report by what is now known as the Social Mobility Commission. The report pointed to inequalities in British society having their roots in the social class structure, which hinders upward social mobility by putting obstacles in the way of working class people seeking access to the elite professions. That's medicine, law, finance, academia, and so on. The then head of the Social Mobility Commission, the Labour MP Alan Milburn, said that class-based prejudice meant that working class applicants, in spite of their qualifications, were being locked out of top jobs. In part, this was because they lacked social credentials that employers place a special value on. These have been called poshness tests, which serve to exclude well-qualified candidates who cannot demonstrate that they have the right sort of social capital. They might be asked about what they like to do in their leisure time, for instance, or what their tastes in food or entertainment are like. On the face of it, these might look like ways of testing how good a fit the candidate might be to the organisation in question, how well he or she might get along with fellow employees. But it could also be seen as evidence that recruiters are only interested in hiring people of a certain type, who fit the ideal in terms of appearance, command of language, self-confidence, the qualities that are loosely known as soft skills, or polish. Accent is present in the mix here. In a 2006 report by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, over 3/4 of the UK employers surveyed said they would discriminate against job applicants on grounds of their accent. While various bits of anti-discrimination legislation forbid employers from discriminating on grounds of the applicant's age or gender or ethnicity or sexual orientation, accent doesn't make the list of so-called protected characteristics. It's been very rare for employers to even consider accent or dialect among the characteristics they might want to protect. The prevailing ideology says that factors such as clarity of speech and articulateness are paramount in certain professions where communication is crucial. Employers may not stop to reflect on whether one can be just as clear and articulate in a non-standard accent as in a standard one, like received pronunciation. Linguistic research has shown time and again that what's treated as right and wrong, or correct and incorrect in language, is a matter of convention, and usually completely arbitrary. In just the same way that wearing a suit and tie to work won't make you any better at your job, so too it can be argued that having the right sort of accent isn't a good indication of how competent you are. Clearly, then, there's a risk that speakers of certain accents might find themselves being shut out of occupations they're ideally qualified for. We know that the legal profession has long had a reputation for being conservative in this respect. Here we can see some quotes from people who participated in our research. One candidate was told at interview that taking elocution lessons was going to be necessary, while another admits to forming snap judgments about others on the basis of their speech patterns. For our study, Accent Bias in Britain, ABB, we recruited actors who would read specially prepared answers to plausible interview questions of the kind that would be asked in an interview for a position as a trainee solicitor in a large commercial law firm. The wording of the answers was decided in collaboration with non-academic lawyers with experience of recruiting graduates from university law schools. We ensured that the actors didn't deviate from the scripts we gave them, which meant we could keep the content of their interview answers consistent from speaker to speaker while varying the accents that they used. The 5 accents we selected were Received Pronunciation, RP, Estuary English, Multicultural London English, General Northern English, and Urban West Yorkshire English from Leeds. We could therefore test several social dimensions at once: standardness versus non-standardness, geographical region, north versus south, and ethnicity, accents associated with white British people versus people from ethnic minorities, as in the case of Multicultural London English. We enlisted a panel of over 1,000 listeners who gave ratings for the answers as well as the perceived qualities of the speakers. We had 2 speakers of each accent, so as to counteract the possibility that listeners were rating the speaker more than his accent. We were also interested in seeing what effect the accent might have on perceptions of the quality of the answer. So we had 2 versions of each, a high quality one and a lower quality one. In practice, both were good, because in the interests of maintaining realism, we thought it would make sense only to include answers that were likely to be given by candidates who'd got as far as a job interview. So none of the answers was bad as such, but some were designed to seem better than others. Listeners didn't get to hear the same answer spoken by 2 different people, as that might have sounded very odd. But we ensured that every listener got to hear all the speakers and all the accents matched up with high quality and lower quality answers. Listeners each heard 20 recordings in total. After hearing each recording, they rated them on the following criteria: the overall quality of the answer, the extent to which it showed expert knowledge, the likelihood that the candidate would succeed as a lawyer, how attractive the candidate seemed as someone you'd want to work alongside, and an overall rating. We assessed these results, which I'll come on to in a second or two, in the context of general attitudes towards accents of English. We did this by asking around 1,000 people to rank labels for accents in terms of the accent's prestige and attractiveness, and compared them with previous data by looking back across the results of half a century of research on this topic. Note that our participants didn't listen to any recordings at this point, they just had the written labels for the different accents. In this chart, we're looking at the overall accent rating on the vertical axis, where accents that come closer to the top of the chart are evaluated more positively. These are results just for respondents from England. There are just over 800 of them in total. On the horizontal axis, we see the rankings for a subset of the accents on the list. Received pronunciation, RP, comes out by far the most favourably judged accent. After that, it's the accent identical to the rater's own accent and the standard accents of North America and Scotland. Down at the bottom of the pile come varieties spoken by ethnic minorities, Afro-Caribbean and Indian, and the accents of Liverpool and Birmingham. You can see that there's very little change in terms of how the accents are ranked, even with a gap of 50 years. The most recent data, shown by the blue dots and line, show that the difference between the highest and lowest rated accents has reduced in size. The overall trend is much the same, however, showing how enduring these attitudes are in British society. The next stage was to get our participants to listen to sound recordings of accents, actual speech in other words. They were in two groups. We had around 800 listeners who didn't have any training in law. These are the non-lawyers. We also enlisted the help of 61 law professionals, many of whom had been involved in hiring new recruits to their organisations themselves. Let's look first at the results for the non-lawyers. Because the responses to the individual questions, expert knowledge, likelihood of success and so on, were so tightly correlated, we collapsed the scores for each into one composite score, which we're calling hireability. We can see, not surprisingly, that RP comes out top of the ranking. It's followed by the two Northern English accents, General Northern English and Urban West Yorkshire English, which rank about the same as one another. The two accents of Southeastern English origin do less well overall. Though they aren't much different from each other in terms of their ratings, they're less positively evaluated than the two non-standard Northern accents. However, it's worth noting that the range of values shown on the vertical axis is rather small. It only runs from 6 up till 7. The evaluations were generally quite positive, and there's not very much, in fact, to distinguish the scores for the RP speakers with those for the estuary English speakers. The lesson here seems to be that people's accent attitudes are much less stark if you get them to listen to recordings of real speakers talking, rather than just relying on whatever positive or negative associations are evoked when you show people the written labels for accents. Here we've split the responses down according to the quality of the answer, high quality versus lower quality. Interestingly, our non-lawyer participants could distinguish the two types of answer quite consistently. For the high quality expert listeners, which are shown by the orangey coloured upper curve, we see that RP once again produces the highest ratings. The other accents perform about the same as one another. For the inferior non-expert answers, in green, RP and General Northern English perform about the same. These answers rank lower than the high quality answers, but as before, you can see that these average ratings fall into a narrow band between 6 and 7 on the rating scale. Accent seems to have less effect here than the quality of the answer does. We take this as a good sign. Listeners are evidently rating the answers more in terms of their content than their form. Lastly, let's see some data from our expert listeners, the 61 lawyers who took part. Like the non-lawyers, they rated the expert answers above the non-expert answers. You can see that there's virtually no difference between the 5 accents here. It appears that these listeners are focused much more on what the interviewees are saying rather than how they say it. What's interesting, though, is that the RP expert and non-expert answers are ranked lower than those for the other 4 accents. For RP, the green and buff rectangles showing the ranges for the ratings that the lawyers used sit somewhat lower down in the figure on the left. It's as though the RP speakers are being expected to give better answers than the other speakers. The bar is being set a bit higher for these speakers, as it were. It's worth remembering that discrimination can work in multiple directions. It may be that the expert listeners here thought the RP speakers ought to be trying a little harder than they did. So what can we conclude from these results? Although we've had to simplify the patterns in our data quite a lot here, several things stand out. Firstly, the accent labels survey, in which a sample of the British public were asked to rate a list of written labels for accents in terms of the accent's prestige and attractiveness, reveals that there's been very little change over the past 50 years. These results point to an established and enduring hierarchy of accents in the UK. Secondly, we have to take into account the difference between seeing the name of an accent and actually hearing someone speaking it. The ratings we obtained by asking people to provide ratings for the interview answers and the individual speakers were more nuanced than we might have expected. Nevertheless, we think that the associations that listeners have between a speaker's accent and his or her perceived competence, expertise and likability could still unfairly influence the outcome of recruitment selection procedures. We cannot discount the possibility that speaking with such and such an accent might make you seem unsuitable for a particular job you're as well qualified for as the next person. More encouragingly, we see signs here that professionals whose job it is to select candidates for positions in the legal sector appear to be able to put those biases to one side and to evaluate interviewees' answers in an objective and even-handed way. In the next section of this part of the workshop, we'll look at some of the data in a little more detail, and we'll then consider the effectiveness of interventions designed to help reduce the effects of unconscious accent bias.